Welcome, everyone. My name is Richard Hara, and I'm your host. This is Social Impact Live, a weekly conversation with members of the Columbia School of Social Work community. I'm pleased to welcome today to the program Assistant Professor Rob Hartley, as well as Sarah Jamgotch, who's an advanced year student in our master's program at the School of Social Work. Together, we'll be talking about how to mobilize marginalized communities to vote. So obviously a very topical conversation for today. I wanted to see, hopefully, if we've got everybody on camera yet. Is that, yep, coming on camera? Yeah, all right, wonderful. And just to remind everybody again, I was mentioning before, we've got a chat box here, and we have reserved the last 10 minutes, certainly, of the program for Q&A, but I would encourage people to submit their questions during the program so that, if possible, we can just weave it into the conversation as we're going along. So I'm looking at the chat box now, and it seems like there's somebody from South Florida who's tuning in. So yeah, a pivotal swing state, and it'll be interesting to hear what the experience is down there. See if other people are logging in and telling us where they're tuning in from. Okay, well, I'm sure that'll be coming in as we continue the program. So Rob and Sarah, welcome to Social Impact Live. It's great to have you here.
Thanks a lot, Richard. It's exciting. And Sarah, it's good to be with you again. We talked on your Social Work Votes podcast.
Yes, it's so great to see you both today. Thank you.
So before talking about how do we mobilize marginalized communities to vote, I wonder if I could just ask you briefly to give our audience just a little bit of a background of how you came to be involved in doing this kind of work. Rob, I know your main research interest is in poverty in the United States, and so how did you get this interest in mobilizing the vote?
So usually my research is economics and thinking about poverty and social policy. But the way this came about was actually because I also have a background in ministry and had been involved with activism and marching along with my church communities. And so it was actually through relationships with people in the Poor People's Campaign. They reached out. I had provided some poverty statistics for them in the past. And they asked about this question. And I thought, well, I have the data, and we can look at just what are the trends in voting participation by income status. So it basically happened out of relationships.
Okay, we'll get back to that in just a minute. And Sarah, before I turn to you, I just want to note that we have people tuning in from the Hudson Valley, northern Louisiana, and Nyarugusu refugee camp in Tanzania, Bangkok, and also good old Queens. So we've got quite a sampling here in our audience. So yeah, Sarah, tell us, I mean, I understand in our policy concentration, and I'm just wondering, how did you decide on choosing policy as your concentration at the School of Social Work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually did come to the School of Social Work with my head going straight to clinical, but slowly realized that all the issues that potential clients would be facing are implicated and impacted by policy, and the clinical and macro and micro, all of that is so intertwined and interrelated. So I found that policy is kind of the fast way to get right to the big issues. So I'm really interested in how the social work ethics and values can influence those policies to help clients and our communities too.
That's wonderful. And I think it's just reflective of the program that we've put together today to have something of the research perspective, but also how do we, what sort of action can we take, right? How does policy get implemented and so on, and how can we affect that process? So going back to the research, Rob, can you tell me a little bit about the brief that you put together and just thinking about, I think what you've called the voting potential of low-income Americans?
Yeah, so the word potential really does wrap up what the brief is about, is looking at the data and saying, how much could their voice matter? And so by low income, we define people who have incomes below 200% of the official poverty threshold. And at first I just look at trends over time and see the differences by income status of voter participation rates. And there's a difference. Lower income folks are voting less often. But the trends move together over time, and you see that they're responding to things in the economy or to candidates. But then what the report does is it moves through steps of saying, how large is this low-income, eligible, non-voting population? How could you compare them to, say, the total electorate? In some states, it's about 1 out of 5 of the total electorate are low-income, eligible non-voters. And then the question of, well, how large is it compared to recent margins of victory? And then the last step was just a thought experiment. If they voted at the same rate as higher income folks, then how many of them, I mean, if they voted 50-50 between two parties, right, then there would be no change. But what percent of them would have to vote against whoever won in the most recent election in 2016 that would actually change something? And so what I saw was that in about 15 states, that group was large enough that if they voted at higher income voting rates, that it could have changed the outcome. 10 of those states were Republican in 2016, 5 of them Democratic. But underlying all of these results is that the report doesn't push toward any outcome. It's about whether or not the voices of low-income voters are actively participating in the electoral process, and what difference it could make if they had greater power and candidates really felt like they needed to speak to issues closest to them.
Okay, so you were looking specifically at 2016. Is that correct?
Well, I looked at recent Senate elections as well.
Okay, yeah.
But the voting trends are over kind of a larger period of time, but then focusing, yes, on this 2016 as just a recent example of what the impact could have been. But we did a similar exercise for Senate races as well.
Yeah, well, because it seems things have, I don't know, have they shifted since 2016? I mean, looking at the 2018 midterm elections and so on. So, I mean, do we see some increased mobilization of the vote?
So that's a great question. I feel like it gets a little beyond like the kind of
Right.
things that I can see and observe.
Mm.
But the idea is that this is kind of a snapshot in time of what the potential might be. And I know that from the Poor People's Campaign perspective, they're really interested in not just having a certain party win in 2020, for example. I mean, I think from their perspective, they feel like they're going to be pushing and arguing and fighting with whoever's in power. But it's a matter of building political power over a long period of time. So as far as what's happening in this election, it's definitely a strange year and hard to predict. Although it seems like early voting, a lot of people have already cast their votes. In a lot of states, I think that there's setting records for the amount of people who have already voted at this point, and the election's in November.
Yeah, I'm just, before I turn to Sarah with a couple of questions, I was I'm still wondering, so do we understand why low-income voters don't vote at the rate of other voters? Does your research address that question, or do we have answers for that?
Well, so there's definitely research outside of what I do that looks at broader constraints on people who are being discouraged from voting. And of course, there's some connection between the states that show up with the largest potential and an overlap with states that were affected by the Voting Rights Act that had pre-clearance conditions because of past voting laws that were prejudicially targeting groups, in particular with a racial bias as well. So some of those states were states that actually show up as having this larger potential for low-income voters. And I think that's the connection, right? There's this artificial potential because they're being kind of pushed out, marginalized from the process somewhat. But then the other question is, in the data, they respond in terms of reasons they don't vote from a list of survey options. And there's really no difference between low income and high income about the number that say they're not voting because of the candidates' issues, or that they don't think it would matter, or they're disinterested. Lower income folks do have more constraints in terms of illness or transportation relative to those with higher income. But there's a real similarity over time about just kind of disillusionment about whether their vote matters.
That's an interesting point, and you know, makes me wonder. So you know, we have that disillusionment and sort of what's happening at the individual actor level, as opposed to what may be more systemic, right, and structural in terms of voter suppression and people's ability to get to the polls and so on. So yeah, Sarah, let me turn to you now, and sort of in your work in organizing and mobile, I mean, so how do you reconcile this kind of you know, the individual versus the systemic and so on, and how does social work votes you know, actually sort of target, you know, ways of getting out the vote?
Yeah, those are great questions, and things that everyone on the team is kind of struggling with always, you know, balancing this. How can one person do all of this work, and is it really worth it, and can we see the change? So these are problems that even within the campaign we're struggling with, but at least for me personally, the way that I'm getting through this is kind of taking a step back and thinking, you know, when November 3rd comes, you know, have I done what I think I could do to affect whatever situation will be there? A lot of voter suppression, like we were talking about, I see that as directly trying to make us lose, and they don't want us to do this, and they want us to be disillusioned. So I'm trying to fight and just realize that that the disillusionment is what is the purpose. So to fight against that, and to really just try to do as much as I can. That's the way that I try to get past that. But it is difficult. You know, there are a lot of constraints like timing, and we're in a pandemic, and there's all these things that are happening. You know, it's not, we don't want to vote shame people to say that that is the only way that you can do, you know, civic engagement. There's so much more, and there's folks that can't vote but still are so involved in this process. So it's kind of, the campaign is trying to broaden our idea of what it means to be engaged civically, and it's not just putting the vote in the mailbox. There's so much more. And we were talking about with the Poor People's Campaign that it's not a candidate, it's not a person or a party, it's really a platform. And this was something that Reverend Barber had talked about a month ago when we had him here at Columbia. And yeah, it's just that shifting of mindset from I'm voting for a person or a candidate or a party to trying to create this voice and uplift this power that a lot of folks can have with if we all could become more civically engaged. But to answer your question about what are we doing more immediately, so every day the social work votes, except for Friday, every day except for Friday, the social work votes has a phone bank. So we are reaching out to voters in Pennsylvania and Florida, which are two important swing states. And yeah, there should be some links that can be thrown in the chat probably, but we've had some great success with them. On Sunday, I host my own. Every Sunday, we reached out to 40,000 people. We texted
Wow.
about registration, and it's really those moments of trying to like uplift one another and just think about the positives and the successes like that. So yeah, I hope that our folks can get the information for the phone banks and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think if we're not able to put it into our chat box now, we can certainly put it up on the site when the recording of the show goes up later. But so, and I know that the Social Work Votes campaign, I mean, we're, and obviously the agencies that we work at and the clients that we serve, you know, are directly aligned with low-income people for the most part, right? And we have this opportunity, not necessarily, well, yeah, I mean, we can address and hopefully fix the injustices that keep people from voting. But I think what you're saying is that, I mean, this is more empowering. This is, your approach is something that's trying to sort of give people the tools they need to exercise their human rights, right? And to think in those terms, as opposed to, you know, the sort of kind of litigation model and things that, you know, I mean, we're already talking about how, you know, what the transfer of power is going to look like when all of this goes to, you know, the courts, no doubt after election day. So again, you know, it's hard to not feel disillusioned, to feel that this is a process that doesn't really represent people's voices and so on. So, but this is something that I think, you know, has gone on for decades, right? And we revisit this conversation every 4 years, every 2 years. And I mean, what is it that we're not getting? I know that's a tough question, but you know, is it simply tactics and sort of, you know, technical approaches, or are we missing a larger conversation here? So, and I'll throw this out to both you and Sarah, Rob, whoever wants to address that question.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I think within the social work community, the voting, there's an organization called Voting is Social Work, and they've been around since the 80s and struggling with this problem as well. I think maybe one of the main things I would love to explore is, can we incorporate voting and civic engagement more concretely in curriculum? I don't think I've ever talked about these topics last year. I know it wasn't an election year, but, you know, how can we start to actually get this in common practice? That would be sort of my first initial thought. I don't know about you, Rob.
Well, so let me start with like the cynical economics take of what can one person matter, right? That's the economists would wonder, like, what's the marginal, you know, contribution that one person makes. But I think that the idea is, okay, this is a long problem of representation. How do we change it? And I think it changes because of intentional work over a long time and building up a movement. And sometimes you can see it in places, but not everywhere at the same time. So I think that you can see successes where this is working, but to see this national movement may take kind of a big spark of awareness, of momentum, motivation. I think that maybe now is the time. I mean, we've seen that people are certainly engaging civically in many ways right now, because we're also facing many challenges as a nation. But certainly that's one of the core ideas behind the campaign, is that building something in the long term to organize, do the work. And I think a lot of times it takes relationships, working together, knowing one another, the education. But that's a lot of people coming together and being consistent over a long period of time. It's about this movement, what's happening right now, not ending in November, which is something I've heard Sarah talking about a lot too, is that we need to forge relationships and make commitments and stay active.
There's a question here from the audience. Do you have any information about low-income voter participation in other countries? Is the US, you know, different in some way? Any idea why?
I mean, it's a very good question. I don't have, I'm sorry, it's not something that I've ever seen or looked at. I don't really have a good answer.
I'll chime in here. I don't know if this is going to be an answer, but I do know that in many countries, voting is a day off. It's mandated. You have to go. You get a fine if you don't. There's laws that are encouraging voting. So I think that would increase turnout for any population, but that's just my guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, certainly we know that, you know, voting rates in the US are quite low compared to other sort of comparable countries. But I don't know that I've read anything that breaks it down according to low income and so on. So that would be something to look at. And sort of going back to your comment or your response, Sarah, about people's access to the polls and so on. So we do have another question here from the audience. Could accessibility be considered a voter suppression tactic as well? You said transportation, low-income communities could explain the problem. Would you think that a national holiday for election day as well as more polling locations be helpful in addressing this problem? So I think you gave the answer to that, Sarah. I think you would endorse that as, yeah.
I would say yes, providing ways for anyone to get to the polls, and talking about access, there are a number of ways that, we're using outdated technology when we're voting. Like people who are blind or deaf are not able to use, the polling machines, and even to walk into poll sites, sometimes there's not like wheelchair accessible access, and it becomes really complicated. And one of the ways that we're trying to sort of support folks through this is actually becoming a poll monitor and noticing when these things are happening. I'll be in PA probably. Being a poll monitor and just marking when these instances are happening. But yeah, to talk about accessibility and in those small ways, yeah, it's definitely huge.
And is that something that people can get involved with on their own? Doesn't have to be through an organization or a program like yours. I mean, just we always get this question. I mean, what can our audience do to support your efforts, all our efforts, right, to get out the vote? Any concrete suggestions?
Yeah, I'll take this one again, Rob, if you don't mind. Yes, well, first, I think it's wonderful that people want to get involved. There are definitely numerous phone banking, text banking. We have a link that I'll hopefully get on the chat about poll monitoring. But I think more importantly, too, is to focus within yourself and think about like, why do I vote? Why don't I vote? Who can I talk to about voting? We all have influence in our own spheres. Like maybe don't try to tackle huge things if that's like, intimidating, but try to just talk amongst, your family and your friends and get the conversation going. So there's a number of ways, but I'll stop there.
Okay, that's helpful. Maybe sort of take a somewhat more abstract perspective on this, but Rob, I'm just wondering, I mean, what would it look like if everyone voted? I mean, if you had all the people who could vote, low income and higher income, I mean, magic presto, we have democracy here in the country. I mean, what do you, how would that impact the political process, or I mean, what's your sense?
So wow, it's a big question for the the time we have here. So let me a couple of things. One, yes, it does seem that overall voting rates are rather low across the boards for the U.S. comparatively. But then if you looked at, well, what if at least we evened out the distribution of who's voting by income, and say that when we're leveling things out, that means a lot more low-income folks are voting. Well, I think it would mean that, one, I want to say that we don't know, for the folks who are not voting now, we can't really presume what their vote would be. And it could go conservative or progressive, it could go either way. But we do believe that there would be a shared interest in income support and social insurance programs and protecting folks' health. I mean, these are the things that I think are consistently associated with points of interest for lower income communities. And in fact, there's research that is backing up how the larger the voter participation is for lower income folks, the more responsive you see these local policies looking. So I would envision it would be one that's representative, but of who we are as a country, but also maybe offers more social protections, which we can now see through this pandemic are relevant for a really large portion of our population.
Okay, great. Yeah, sort of just how it just shifts the conversation, right, towards possibly some topics as opposed to others leading up to the election.
It's something that the campaign always says is, let's change the narrative by changing the narrators. And they're really trying to lift up the voices and concerns of those who have been marginalized historically.
bring that into the conversation. So personally, do you think we'll see any policies enacted in the near future to increase access to polls for low-income groups? I mean, now that we've sort of identified that they are being marginalized and their voices aren't being heard, any policies out there that might address that?
I think what would be, I think probably that question was in terms of federal policies. I think what's really important too are local policies and state policies. So that kind of brings importance to also down ballot races that we didn't get to talk about, unfortunately. But yeah, I think there are ideas. There are a number of things that people have floated as ideas that would be very representative. They do exist. It's just, yeah, getting those empowered to enact those policies, and so.
Okay, I've been told that we can go over just a little bit to squeeze in a couple of extra questions here. So how will social workers deal with the issue of intimidation at the polls if that happens this year? Has there been any conversation about that and what we're doing to counter that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to take that one again. Yeah, intimidation is definitely a topic that is of concern for a lot of people. Who's going to be poll monitoring, poll watching. I think just relying on one another, staying in communication with one another, and really advocating for the folks at the polls will be really important. But definitely don't put yourself in danger as well. This election year has been crazy, so who knows what will happen. But just leaning on each other, leaning on the community is the best way I can see that going well.
I think key to that too is training, right? I mean, your organization has training and resources. There are people who really know what the resources are to go to, and I know that the Poor People's Campaign has it's called the We Must Do More, mobilizing, organizing, registering, and educating. And part of that is they're bringing in trainers from legal firms that have real expertise about process and what to do. And so I think if you're volunteering, find a way to get trained as you get involved.
Well, if sort of early voting is any indication, it seems like we've got quite a number of people turning out to vote this year. At the end, I'm not sure what the total number is going to look like, but certainly there seems to be a tremendous amount of energy, and I want to thank you both for what you've been doing to sort of raise consciousness about the more marginalized voices, right, and people as part of the voting process. So I think we've run out of time. I want to thank our guests again, Rob Hartley and Sarah Jamgotch, for joining us here today at Social Impact Live. Next week, we'll have a panel to talk about the Action Lab that we have founded and recently certified as a center here at the Columbia School of Social Work. So want to continue the conversation, but until then, thanks very much. Take care.